When people think of climate change, I feel that there's this perception that because it's a global event, it's almost far away. And I find that that's sort of where Climate Matters comes in and really shines because the initiative shares all of this great data that shows the local effects of climate change. And today, meteorologists across the country are educating their audiences with this local data that's coming from the program. But 10 years ago, it was just a pilot program that started right here at WLTX, and it was led under the direction of meteorologist Jim Gandy, who is joining me today. And we're going to talk about this program, and I can't wait to hear about how this even led to your one-on-one with President Obama at the White House.
Well, a lot happened during the time that I was doing Climate Matters, which, by the way, we aired for the first time on August the 2nd, 2010.
How did you get involved in this? Because I think, 10 years later, it's become a lot more part of a conversation than what it was 10 years ago. And it's probably a large part because of this.
Well, let me give you a little context. I was serving on the Station Scientist Committee when Joe Whitty contacted the committee and wanted an advisor to the program that they wanted to get started and they wanted to do at George Mason University. I thought, well, this is something that I might be interested in. So I put my name in the hat. Unfortunately, I didn't get it. A friend of mine got it instead. And so when I talked to Joe Whitty, I said, yeah, look, if you need somebody or if you need some help or anything I can do, just let me know. A few days later, he called back and he said, would you consider being the test case? And I said, well, here's why I should be the test case. I don't live in a red state. I live in a dark red state. And if you can talk about climate change here, you can talk about it anywhere. Well, I'm not sure that that was the convincing argument, but they didn't want a big market. They didn't want a small market. They wanted a medium-sized market, one that they could analyze pretty well. And that's what they did. Now, we got the grant in 2009. We started the planning for that grant on November the 30th of 2009. I went to Washington to meet with everybody that was going to be involved in the project. But you have to understand, it was, to give it some historical context, that was also about the same time that ClimateGate started to unfold. And so I'm hearing all this noise going on about how it's a hoax and the whole thing, and I'm thinking, what have I got myself into? But the meeting went well, the planning went well, and we finally got everything in place so that we could start Climate Matters, which was no small feat, by the way. And we started it on August the 2nd of 2010. By that time, ClimateGate was kind of a fading memory. It was just noise, wasn't anything really to be concerned about. And we developed, I think it was 13 different modules that we were going to air over the next year. And we did that. And the results of the study showed that viewers who watched it on WLTX were held ideas that were more consistent with what the science was saying. So it turned out to be successful. And from there, they continued to expand the program. And today, 10 years later, more than 900 broadcast meteorologists are using the material that's being generated by the program.
That's incredible. What was some of the material starting out? Is it still consistent with the type of material that's being produced today? What is it that people are being educated in specifically?
Well, obviously, one of the first ones that we did was on the heat and how our changing climate was also changing our summer heat. And we did a program. And keep in mind, these were only about 45-second programs, but we showed how as we continue to warm our climate, our temperatures were going to change during the summertime. Ironically, In 2010, it turned out to be the hottest summer on record at that time for Columbia. But it wasn't because of the high temperature. It was because of the low temperature. And that is consistent with greenhouse effects, because we were seeing an increase in carbon dioxide and we were seeing an increase in water vapor in the atmosphere. And both of those were combining to raise our low temperature. So here it was, the hottest summer on record, but it was because of the low temperature. I went back into some of our famous heat waves, like in the 1950s. And yes, the high temperature was hotter, but at night, the low temperatures were cooler, and significantly so. And that's what made the difference.
Wow. And I mean, as we were discussing, you were truly onto something because, looking back at all of the data from Columbia since 1888, 7 of the 10 warmest years on record were after 2010. So on that top 10 list, they've all been in the past decade. 2017 was the warmest year, then 2016, 2015, the top 3. 2019 is number 7 on the list. I mean, you look at those numbers and it truly is staggering. And this has all just happened since Climate Matters started at WLTX 10 years ago.
I know. It's amazing how things have changed, but there were also some other things about the program that I did not expect. We began seeing the effects of climate change in things other than temperature. We began seeing it in precipitation, and we began seeing the effects of carbon dioxide on vegetation. The story for which I got an award was looking at a study that was done at Duke University, in which they demonstrated how the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was affecting not only the growth of poison ivy, but also the toxicity of poison ivy. And as it turns out, the toxicity has doubled since the 1950s. This was clear cut because of the increase in carbon dioxide. And it was one of the first examples of ongoing climate change. So it wasn't something that was going to occur in the far future. It was happening now. And furthermore, if we continued on our path, we were going to double the toxicity again by the latter part of this century. So that was kind of wake-up call. Actually, that story generated more reaction than any of the stories we did in that first year.
Wow. And it's one of those unintended consequences that I think, people think warming, and it really is so much more than just that. So it's stories like that I think it really brings it down to the viewer's level, and it just shows why this is such an important thing to get out there. And that sort of leads me to another question too. Were you ever worried about what the reaction was going to be, in a state like South Carolina, where maybe politics, unfortunately, we're very intertwined with climate right now, and the reaction really could have gone either way? This was the test pilot.
Well, actually, one of the reasons why a lot of TV stations did not do anything about climate change was because it had already become divisive among a lot of viewers. There was this element out there that was just, blatantly against the idea that it was happening, though the science was clear. And in the project, what the goal of the project was to educate people about the science. So our game plan, let's stick to the science. The politics will take care of itself. We want to educate people about what's going on, because if you're going to do anything about it, you've got to have information to begin with. And without good information, you can't make good decisions. We're seeing that right now in the coronavirus. Well, the same thing was going on with climate change. And so, yes, there was some concern. We were well prepared for the blowback that I like to say never came. Yes, we had some people who were upset about what we were doing. One person even called our GM and said, "You need to fire Jim Gandy." Fortunately, he did not do that. And the rest is history. The program continued on. Now, keep in mind that Climate Matters, when I was doing it, was a year-long project. It was a scientific research project. And what's interesting about that is that we were pioneering something that had never been done. So we had to develop the techniques in which to analyze the data that we were getting. It was tough on many different levels because here we were doing a field experiment, the likes of which had not been done before. So we were having to develop the criteria. We were developing the educational program. And it turned out to be tougher to implement the program on TV than we had anticipated, because there were all kinds of things that interfered with putting the segments on the air. You know, you only have so much time on TV, and that tended to be a problem. 2010 was an election year, so my time was consistently being cut. And so sometimes I would have to just cut out the segment altogether because I couldn't do it. We were also going through a transition from analog TV to digital television. And in addition, we were putting in new graphic systems in the Weather Center. And so with all of these distractions and everything going on, here we were trying to do a scientific experiment, do it correctly, and get some results. So it was quite a year, but we did not get much pushback. And like I say, on the poison ivy story, the reaction was more amazement than anything else, because people had not considered that before. And quite frankly, I hadn't either.
Yeah.
So it went really well. And our news director at the time said, "I get more complaints about what our anchors wear on the air every day than I ever got about Climate Matters."
Wow. So, you know, that is definitely a success for anybody who is in the know about the industry. You know, that's a lot. Fortunately, a lot of viewers do complain about things like that.
Yeah.
But if they're going to complain about that, that's better. At least they're getting the climate information.
Well, that they were, and
Yeah.
so the year went better as time went along, and more of our segments actually occurred in 2010 than in 2009. We wrapped it up, and once we wrapped up the project on the air, then but the project wasn't over, because we still had surveys to do, because they did a pre-survey and a post-survey to find out how people reacted during the year. And it took some time to finish up the post-survey. So our first publication, scientific publication, didn't occur until 2013. And then the main publication actually was in the January issue. I want to say it was 2014. It might have been 2013. But it was in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society.
Wow.
And that got the ball rolling. Being the person that was kind of the guinea pig in this, I did not get to see any of the results until we were writing the paper. And the first time I read the first draft of the paper, it just blew me away, because it dispelled the myth that if you talk about climate change, you will turn people off. As it turns out, the data shows that was not the case. People wanted to know, and people are interested in what the science has to say. And it turned out that that was the case. People were interested in the science. So it was never my intention to stop doing Climate Matters at the end of that year. And with the help of Climate Central, I was able to keep the project going. They struggled because they had to find the funding to keep what they were doing going.
Yeah.
But slowly but surely, it began to coalesce into a program that people wanted. The numbers started to rise. The funding was coming in to do it. And probably in the last 5 years, it has really taken off. So the first 5 years was a struggle. The last 5 years, it has really become commonplace across the country.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. And what was the turning point? I mean, you got an invitation to the White House to speak with then President Obama, and that was all related to this work, right? Was that sort of the turning point in this conversation?
You know, I don't know that was really a turning point. I think it was. I'm not sure that I can pin down a turning point. But interest in climate matters amongst broadcasters started to grow. When I first started Climate Matters, there was a significant segment of broadcast meteorologists that didn't want to either touch it or didn't believe it was occurring. But over the years, we began to break through their resistance. And people started getting interested in what we were presenting. And then it just took off. I'm not sure if I can pinpoint a specific time, but certainly in the last 5 years, the numbers have grown, and Climate Central has expanded Climate Matters to journalists. And now there are close to 900 journalists who are using the material.
And so that's in addition to the almost 900 broadcast
meteorologists. So it you know, in the beginning, the problem was trying to get funding to keep the small group that was going. Now it's funding a huge a project that has over 1,800 people. And
Wow.
Climate Matters, Climate Central tries to localize the information. So they're trying to specifically gear each topic to a local community. And that's a tall order.
Yeah. I mean, every city across the country. But it's amazing because I look at those graphs that they put out, and I'm honestly kind of amazed at the consistency because, there are parts of the world that are warming much faster than others. But then you look at the data that they have city by city, and you notice that really it's not even, a question when you look at all of that information, just how concerning it is. I mean, when I did the weather in New York and in Florida and here in South Carolina, and just have noticed that in each of those places, we are just doing nothing but breaking warm records left and right. And the cold records are so far and in between. And I'm sure every broadcast meteorologist and meteorologist, even working operationally, sees that pattern. It is so hard to ignore that climate change is happening.
Yeah, the data is unambiguous. There's no question about it. We are warming. We know why we're warming. We know what it would take to at least slow it down. So that goes back to, well, where's the will to do that? And, it's kind of interesting. Over the last 10 years, there was a statement that was made that I thought was pretty interesting. And I can't even remember who made it. But the statement is change doesn't come from Washington. Change comes to Washington. And it's going to take individual action to finally get the action that we need from Washington. And that's going to come to you, the local viewer. It's going to be the action that you take that's going to make the difference. Now, we're already seeing actions by companies, big and small, that are making changes to reduce their carbon footprint. People are doing that as well. And probably the last that will be doing it will be the federal government.
Yeah, well said. And so sort of in that frame, looking back, now 10 years later, what do you think, about this conversation from when you started Climate Matters in 2010 to now, the year 2020, we're now 10 years farther into the future. What does the next 10 years look like to you? Do you think that we're on the right track right now?
Yes, I do think we're on the right track. And it's interesting that you asked that question, because I asked that question 10 years ago. Wow. When Ed Maybach at George Mason University, who's the director of the Center for Climate Change Communication, he and I were talking about, I told him, I said, I think this is the future of weathercasts. I think that we're going to transition to a point to where a discussion of climate change is going to have to include, it's going to have to be included in the weathercast. It's not going to be just some separate topic that's covered. It's going to be part of the weathercast, the weather presentation. Now, this is 10 years ago. Nobody's doing that. And here I'm saying, 10 years from now, I think this is going to be a commonplace thing. And here we are 10 years later, and it's pretty commonplace. Yeah. There are a lot, almost every city in every TV market, somebody in that market's doing it. There were unintended consequences of what I did. Because I was talking about it, I became the de facto climate expert. And it is true. I mean, I was doing a lot of studying on climate change. I really consider myself an expert, but other people did and still do today. And I do a number of presentations on climate change. But in doing Climate Matters, there were things that happened that I didn't anticipate. And they're kind of like forks in the road when you're going down the road of life. And one of those occurred in 2013. In February of that year, Heidi Cullen, a scientist at Climate Central, tweeted out a graphic which showed how much of our vegetables are grown in California. Well, I had been monitoring the snowpack in California because I've got relatives in California. And it was probably the lowest snowpack in history. And I told him, I said, wow, this next summer is going to be really tough. You need to be prepared. So I approached the TV station. I told them what I was seeing. And I said, this also means that the cost of vegetables are going to be going up for us here in South Carolina because we depend on California for some of those vegetables. So Rich Odell said, great idea. And hence we started Gandy's Garden. That was in 2013, and I didn't expect it, but the garden took off. People loved the garden, still do. And it gave us a way to demonstrate to people how a changing climate someplace else was going to impact them locally through the price of food. We started the garden, it took off, and then something else happened. that I didn't expect. I started seeing the effects of climate change on the garden.
Yeah.
Now, you've already mentioned that we've had some really hot years.
Yeah.
Well, those hot years translated into problems for the garden.
Wow.
And they were related to the change in the local climate. And I didn't expect that. So that another unintended consequence of what I was doing. And keep in mind, all of this is happening in just the last decade. And really, for me, it was 8-9 years because I retired in 2019. So it's amazing how the program grew and how it has changed. And I've been getting phone calls from meteorologists and other markets about starting a garden in their area.
Wow, that's exciting to hear, and I mean, definitely, I can tell you, it's not easy to garden. I give a lot of credit to farmers who now especially have to deal with, a changing climate. It is incredibly difficult. And now COVID and Gandy's garden, of course, which is a totally different conversation, has now added an extra element of, okay, we're not quite as food secure as we hope to be, and we are a very developed nation,
Yeah.
Imagine
which is another reason why we need to promote the idea of a garden. And I'll go one step further. I've made this proposal to elementary schools before I retired, and that is, forget the science lab. You don't need a science lab in elementary school. What you need is a garden. Now, think of it. A garden is not an expensive thing to get going, so it doesn't require a lot of money. What kid does not like to go play in the dirt? And think of the topics that you can cover in that garden. You're not just growing vegetables. You're looking at insects. You're looking at soil. You're looking at the weather. You're doing chemistry. I mean, there's just a wealth of information that can be gleaned from a garden. And so for children, I think a garden in an elementary school is the ideal science lab.
Love that idea. I really would love for that to happen. There has to be a way to make that popular, because 10 years from now, I would love for that to be the norm. I think that would be really amazing.
And it may be, because we don't know how things are going to change specifically in our area over the next decade, but I can foresee it happening. Certainly because it's so easy. It doesn't require a great deal of effort. You don't need a building. You don't have to spend everything on a science lab. And, in this state, not all school districts have financial resources to build science labs. So for those, particularly those districts that are poor financially, the garden is the ideal science lab.
I agree. And, of course, you're also working on other projects too, even though you are technically, on paper retired. What are some of the other things that you are now doing to sort of keep the conversation going?
Since I've retired, I don't have the day-to-day problems with having to deal with a forecast or the graphics, so I can concentrate on different things. I've already been involved in one legal case as an expert witness. I'm starting to write, and the blog that I let go because I just had too many things on my plate, I'm getting ready to start it back up, Weather and Climate Matter. It's already there, the blog is, and in fact, I've already updated the structure of the blog. I just haven't posted anything yet, and I'm getting ready to do that. And so, and that will explain some of the things I'm going to be doing. I found that the blog was better at being able to talk about things than social media. One, because the blog, I can put everything into the blog, photos and video, and not have to worry about formats on the different social media sites, because Twitter and Facebook have different formats. So that's always a constant problem there. So I can upload it to YouTube, put it on the blog, and then it's ready. I still have the social media. Also, something that I did a long time ago, and it has evolved as well. For those of you who have tablets and things like that, there is a program called Flipboard or Flipbook, and it's made up of magazines. And I started a magazine in which I can clip articles, put it into my magazine. And I've got two magazines. One is called Climate Change, and the other one is Gandy's Garden. And it's starting to get quite a few followers. And I'm continually updating it every day with articles from other publications. And I actually started doing that just for me, because oftentimes there would be an article, I couldn't read it right away. I could throw it into the program, into the magazine, and go back and read it later. So that's one reason why I did that. I want to stay in the conversation.
Yeah.
People don't understand the complexities of climate change. And as an expert, I hope to be able to kind of help them understand what's going on and why it's important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, programs like Climate Matters, the work that, we have done at WLTX and continue to do, and what meteorologists across the country are doing, and really across the nation, worldwide as well, I feel that that is so important because, people only know what they are able to see. And sometimes when we go about our day, we have so many different responsibilities. And I think it's our responsibility to sort of show people, well, this is what we're seeing weather-wise, because there's a lot that kind of goes into weather that's very personal, as far as like, I remember it being really hot, but that doesn't always translate into what the actual numbers, are saying. So, well,
and that's why we keep records.
Exactly.
Because our memory isn't always the best.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I've had people who, are a bit confrontational about climate change say things like, well, this summer's nothing like back in, insert year where it was so hot that we had to do this. But that is just an experience, and the actual numbers don't support, necessarily that experience. And
our memories oftentimes are clouded not just by the event itself, but how it may have impacted us, but it may not have impacted other people the same way.
Yeah.
So that's why we keep records. That's why we take a look at the data. But as broadcast meteorologists, we're trained in meteorology. Not necessarily trained in climate science, but we are trained in meteorology, which is a related field. And I think that we're best equipped to be able to talk to people on their level so that they can understand what's going on.
Yeah, that's really well said. And hopefully this convinces people who might have otherwise been a bit reluctant to talk to their viewers maybe about these conversations, or somebody who's watching who, will hopefully now consider just how important this is, not just to our planet, but to each individual as well. This is climate change is something that is going to affect everybody, whether it be, tomorrow or in, their kids and grandkids' lifetimes. I think a lot of times the conversation is, this is going to impact your kids and grandkids, but the reality is that it's impacting all of us really as we have this conversation right now. So
yeah, I think so too. And as I went through the program Climate Matters, I was constantly running into things that I didn't expect.
Yeah.
And of course, Gandy's Garden is a good example of that. And I think the two actually come together pretty well. I have been encouraging broadcast meteorologists who are willing to do the work. And believe me, it is a lot of work, as you know.
Yeah.
If they can do Climate Matters and do a garden and combine the two, then they've got quite a program. That's something that's going to be of real interest to the viewer. And every market's different. The data for Columbia is not the data from Detroit. So you've got to localize this for your community. And I think that's the science is the same everywhere, but the data is not the same. And that's where it gets very interesting. How does what's happening worldwide affect me locally?
That is brilliantly said, and so true, because I'll tell you, every little ounce that Mother Nature gives us of forgiveness in the garden is incredibly grateful for me. I mean, we had a very mild winter, which sounds wonderful, but it did really ruin the structure of certain things. That 100-degree day in October, the cauliflower was struggling,
Yeah,
it really was.
it will. and it's kind of interesting. Climate Matters has helped me learn a great deal about climate change. The garden has opened my eyes to climate change, but it's also opened my eyes to other things.
Yeah.
When I started the garden, there were two things that we decided we were going to do from the very beginning. One, we were going to prepare for the next drought. And two, we wanted it to be organic. We wanted to use as few chemicals as we could get away with. It brought the chemistry out, because you've got to fertilize, but you just don't get a bag of fertilizer and throw it. You've got to understand what the soil needs to have a successful garden. So there were just so many things that became possible with Climate Matters and with the garden. And there's just a wealth of content there. And, as a local broadcaster, sometimes you're just dying for content, but you're never for want of content. I remember talking about Gandy's garden at a scientific conference. Now, this was a scientific conference that was dominated by technology, okay? And so I got up there, and here are these scientists, these broadcast meteorologists out there, and I said, well, I'm going to talk about a garden. And everything you've seen here at the conference, that's great stuff. But this is probably going to be the least technical discussion that you're going to have at this conference. And at the end, I said, I don't want the perfect garden, because I want something to talk about. As it turns out, I don't have the perfect garden, so I've got plenty to talk about.
Yep. And what's amazing is that people are dealing with the same exact thing. That's why I love the Facebook group that just got started up this past spring, the WLTX Gandy's Gardeners, because, we have worms in our tomatoes. There are 5 or 6 other people that are also saying that they have that. It's amazing how everybody goes through the same exact thing, because we're all, living in it.
Oh, I know it. So again, this all started 10 years ago when I started with Climate Matters, and to see how it has progressed, how it has changed, how it's evolved in 10 years has truly been amazing. And it's been rewarding.
It's amazing. And thank you so much for reflecting on those 10 years, because I'm pretty excited to see what the next 10 have come with such a great foundation.
Well, you're doing a good job. Keep it going, and I can't wait to see what you do.
Thank you. Me too, because honestly, you never know what you're even going to get tomorrow. That's the best part about gardening. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it.